Good morning, everyone. Good evening if you are connecting from Japan. And welcome to this second webinar of the year on EU-Japan relation organized by the International Affairs Institute. My name is Lorenzo Mariani. I am research fellow in the Global Actors Department at IAI. And it is with a great pleasure, apologies, and it's with a great pleasure that I will be moderating today's conversation on EU-Japan cooperation in countering disinformation campaigns. So unfortunately, it's common knowledge that fake news and disinformation campaign are nowadays a widespread phenomena. And as we have learned, especially during the pandemic, this phenomena can be especially problematic for democratic systems. And so there's a growing debate within our societies on how to address these issues without undermining the freedom of speech or the benefits that comes from the use of digital media. Another thing that we have learned is that in order to mitigate and contain the damages that comes from disinformation, a collective effort is required. And so we have governments that are developing new institutions and new tools to protect their citizens. We have the news industry, which is focusing more and more on high quality journalism and in building or rebuilding trust with their audiences. We have social media platforms that are implementing new tools, and they are acquiring more manpower to fight disinformation in their platforms. We have educational institutions which are at the forefront in the promotion of news literacy, and of course, I mean, even our effort as individuals is required in order not to be the beacon that retransmits disinformation. This was just to introduce today's topic. I don't want to steal too much of your time because today we will hear from three very distinguished guests. And together with them, we will be looking at some of these issues. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you the panelists. We will hear from them in this order. We will have Paola Gori, Secretary General and Project Manager Leader at the European Digital Media Observatory. We will hear from Kyoko Kuhara, Research Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. And last but not least, Professor Tetsuro Kobayashi, Associate Professor at City University in Hong Kong. Just a quick reminder for the speakers, I'm going to leave the floor to you for your presentation. You will have up to 10 minutes. A side note for the audience, I do encourage you to be active in this webinar and write down in the Q&A chat your question. And at the end of all presentation, I will cherry pick a few questions and use them to stimulate the debate. So having said that, I think that it's time to start. And so Paola, if you're ready, I will now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting event. So very briefly before starting, I just wanted to introduce you the European Digital Media Observatory, which was established by the European Commission almost 1 year ago. The leader of EDMO is the European University Institute, where I'm based. And we also have other partners, which is Aarhus University, Athens Technology Center, and Pagella Politica, that is an Italian fact checker. And overall, what is important to know about EDMO, we are an independent platform, and the aim of EDMO is really to act as a platform, as a hub, as a community builder, because one of the things we know is that in order to fight against disinformation, you need a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary approach. And this is what EDMO will be doing. We will gather stakeholders, we will gather facts and evidence in order to have all the different elements then to fight against online disinformation. And very soon we will also have national hubs in all the member states. And we are really looking forward to that, because they will actually provide us with the local information at member state level, which is very important. And the overall reasoning behind is that, and I will come back to this also later, is that we really need to do analysis of actors, vectors, tools, and methods and targets that, and the impact on society of this information actually to tackle that. So these are the 5 pillars of EDMO, but you can find them on our website, and I don't want to lose too much time on that now. So when we tackle online disinformation, it's a balancing exercise, because on one side we want to protect the democratic process, and so we want to have citizens making informed decisions, and also now during the pandemic, we have to protect their health, their security. On the other side, you still have to, of course, respect fundamental rights such as freedom of expression and information, and you want to avoid what is the so-called Ministry of Truth. All this is done in a fast evolving environment, because technology is evolving, tools and actors, and disinformation strategies. So you have to find policies which are fit for the purpose, but also that kind of evolve during time. And very briefly, what happened in the EU is in this slide. In 2015, there was the launch of the Stratcom task force. We then had also joint framework on countering hybrid threats. And then 2018 was kind of a turning point. There was a report by a high-level group on fake news and online disinformation in Europe. Then the first ever self-regulatory tool, which is the Code of Practice on Disinformation. We had a communication on tackling online disinformation and the action plan on disinformation. 2019, we established the Rapid Alert System. And then 2020, again, lots of activity. EDMO was established. There was, because of the pandemic, a joint communication on COVID-19 disinformation. And then the European Democracy Action Plan was published, the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, the Media Action Plan. So lots of things happened actually at the end of 2021 and of 2020, sorry. And in 2021, we will have the guidance of the Commission on how to strengthen this code of practice, and actually also the new code, hopefully by the end of this year. I cannot go through everything, it's going to be too long, but I selected a few items which I think are important for this aim. So the report was basically the trigger of everything. So there was a high-level group convened by the European Commission, chaired by Professor Madeleine de Kock-Boening, and the report basically came out with 5 main pillars. So one is the sharing of data. So in order to understand this information, you need to do research, and in order to do that, you need to have data. Full stop. Easy. Easily said, very difficultly applied. And then you have to promote media and information literacy. You have to develop tools to empower users and citizens. And you have to safeguard diversity and sustainability of the news media ecosystem. And to go back to the data, you have to do continued research on the impact of disinformation. This means that we have to start by giving definitions, and there are a lot of items to be defined, but probably the most important is disinformation as such. And in the report, this definition was given, and this is what we still adopt at EU level. So it includes all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. And I'm saying this because it's very important. Sometimes, for example, when you talk to an American audience, they would refer also to misinformation. In this case, in Europe, misinformation means that you are not, there is the harm element is not present. So it's kind of different. In the communication on tackling online disinformation, again, there was this idea of a secure and resilient society, and in particular the election process, transparent, trustworthy, and accountable online ecosystem. Media literacy, again, is a key pillar, support for quality journalism, and countering internal and external disinformation threats through strategic communication. So here, this is where the Commission, following the report, it comes out with a communication, and the communication is then followed by the action plan. And the action plan is a joint effort between the Commission and the High Representative. And the aim of the action plan is to have a at EU level coordinated approach against online disinformation. And it is based on 4 main pillars. The first one is improving the capabilities of the EU institutions to detect, analyze, and expose disinformation. The second one is strengthening coordinated and joint responses. For example, the rapid alert system. In this case, basically it is centralized at EU level, and it's a coordination among the relevant ministries in the various member states. They share best practices. They share, when they detect something, they immediately share it with the other member state and with the institutions. Mobilizing the private sector, and this is where the code of practice, which I will explain, comes up, and then raising awareness and improving societal resilience. And here, fact checkers and researchers, as well as media literacy experts, play an important role. So I wanted to focus on the code of practice now, because this was really, in the world, the first self-regulatory tool in the sector. Recently, we saw that, for example, in Australia, they adopted a similar tool, and it was kind of something very innovative. It was, for sure, the natural first step. I mean, you cannot go directly with co-regulation and regulation in a field like this. As we were saying before, there is a balance to be made. There is a ministry of truth to be avoided. It is self-regulation, but as it is mentioned in the Better Regulation Toolbox of the Commission, self-regulation in Europe means that there is still kind of an input from the European Commission. And this is what happened also with the Code of Practice that is signed by the main online platform. You can see here on screen, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, and also by the advertisers. And they have a yearly reporting exercise. And following the communication on COVID, actually, there is a monthly reporting exercise that is done on what the platform do to fight against online disinformation related to COVID-19. It is based on 5 pillars. So the scrutiny of advertisement placement, the political advertisement and issue-based advertising, the integrity of the services, empowering consumers' services, and empowering the research community. I won't go through all of those because it's going to be too long. But what you should know is that following the code, there was an assessment. There were actually various assessments. The last one was done by the European Commission. And of course, it was what was acknowledged was the fact that it was a first step, that it started reducing opportunities for advertisement placement related to the dissemination of disinformation. We started having some transparency of political advertising. Trustworthy information there was a promotion of trustworthy information, and in general, it was a collaborative effort. However, the Commission and also the other organizations who did the assessment of the code also identified some very, let's say, still margin for improvement. The first one, which is very important, is that there is a lack of commonly shared definitions. And this means that basically the risk is that every signatory basically interprets the definitions differently. And so basically also the reporting would be different. The other thing is that, and this is largely discussed, is the fact that there is a lack of KPIs and appropriate monitoring. So it is difficult basically to assess the reports. It is said that the advertising sector should be more involved. As I was mentioning before, there are some signatories, but still not that many. The lack of access to data for allowing independent evaluation and research is something that is missing. And this is something, let me say, on which EDMO is working a lot. And we really hope that we will be able to finally kind of set a framework to do that in full respect of GDPR. And it is also difficult to understand the timeliness and impact of the actions of the signatories. And related to the access to data, the cooperation between the platforms and the research community should still be developed. So basically, the code, it was a first good step. What is missing now is that basically it is difficult to evaluate the reports, to compare the reports, also because they are all done individually by the signatories without, let's say, a common structure. And now, I'm sorry for these slides, which looks complicated. I'm going to explain it to you. So basically, as if you think back of the roadmap I was mentioning before, 2020 was again kind of a milestone. And this is basically the end of 2020. The Commission came up with the European Democracy Action Plan and the Digital Services Act. What's basically the Digital Services Act is a regulation, which means in Europe, a regulation is a tool that you use to really harmonize because it would apply immediately to all member states, and there is no reception, let's say, like the directive. So it's not, let's say, applied differently in the member states. So the idea is really to make sure that there is an harmonized approach in Europe. The Digital Services Act this is the proposal. This means that we will need to wait at least 2 years until it is adopted, at least, and there might be a lot of changes. So the strategy is to come with a European Democracy Action Plan with some dispositions that can be implemented more quickly, and then we will go to the Digital Services Act when this will be its time, its moment. And the European Democracy Action Plan is based on 3 pillars: promote free and fair elections, support free and independent media, and counter disinformation. And within this, the Commission announced that it would publish a guidance that will be actually published very soon. And according to this guidance, the signatories should strengthen the code of practice. So basically, following the assessment, it is said, okay, now this tool should be kind of have a phase 2, a version 2. We will issue guidance, and you signatories will work on a new code of practice. The Digital Services Act is very briefly just what I wanted to mention. I will go back to this in the next slides, but as you can see there, the idea is that there are different, let's say, levels of responsibilities according to the dimension of the intermediary. And very quickly on the Digital Services Act and what refers to online disinformation. So the main focus of the DSA is actually illegal content. So it's not legal content like many, let's say, contents related to online disinformation, but there are still things related to disinformation, and it is really the first step to move towards co-regulation. So let me just mention some examples. The platforms, they have to fix the vulnerabilities against their manipulation when the manipulation has the aim of amplifying harmful behaviors, such as you can see, spread of political disinformation, hoaxes, and manipulation during pandemics. This means that basically the platforms will have the responsibility to assess and mitigate the risk their system poses, and there's going to be an independent audit on what they are doing. There are rules on transparency of content moderation decisions. This, of course, apply also to illegal content. And there are audit reports and independent research on the ways that the platform apply that. And then there is the user empowering side. So users should make informed decisions about the advertising they see. So they should know why they are targeted by advertisements, who paid for those. And they should also see clearly when the content is sponsored or organically posted on a platform. And the platforms on their side, they have to maintain repositories. So basically, these repositories could be accessed to actually see which were the ads displayed and who paid, basically. And they have to basically assess whether and how the advertising system is manipulated. Because as we know, behind online disinformation, we have there can be a political motivation, but one other big reason behind is the financial motivation, the economic one. You can gain a lot of money through this information. Then, of course, you have the social one, for example, and other cases. And so basically, this means that to go back to co-regulation, when the Commission sees that there is a systemic risk that basically the system is manipulated, it would invite the very large online platforms to basically get in touch with other platforms and also with civil society, and to draw a code of conduct, which is something similar to the current code of practice. So as you see, basically to quickly sum up, we started with self-regulation, we are moving towards co-regulation, and there is a stronger responsibility of the platforms and their role. This is just to recap what I just said. The overall strengthening of the code of practice should, to go back to what we were saying before, there should be a way to monitor the impact of the policies of the actions of the platforms, and we need KPIs. There should be a focus on visibility of reliable information, reduction of monetization, going back to what we were saying before, transparent standards and procedure for non-discrimination collaboration and for collaboration between fact checkers and platform. We already see, for example, just mentioning one example, but Facebook is collaborating with fact checkers in respective member states for them to fact check some items. Measures to limit the artificial amplification of disinformation campaign and data disclosure. Overall, and this brings me, I'm finishing, and this brings me to the very beginning of what I was saying. The idea is to create resilience, to have a multidisciplinary approach, because we need to really understand the tools, the actors, the vectors, and the targets. Let me just mention briefly an example. I mean, on the actors side, for example, if you have, for example, a state-sponsored disinformation item, there could be the actor itself could be composed of many different actors. You could have the first trigger that comes from the state or the government organization, and then basically the message is given to someone else who actually produces this message. And then it is put online, and then it is shared by another agent. So you see that there, within one agent, let's say definition, you have different actors. And it is very, very important that we understand the whole dynamics and mechanisms to actually tackle online disinformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. No, indeed. I mean, I've left you a little bit more time because I mean, I saw that there's plenty of things to discuss. I already have a few questions for you, but of course I'm gonna raise this during our debate. Let's move on with Kyoko. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo. This is Kyoko Kuwahara, and research fellow at Japan Institute of International Affairs. And thank you so much for inviting me to spend some time with you to talk about Japan-EU cooperation in countering disinformation campaign. I'm very glad to be invited here. And before talking about Japan's policies and challenges against disinformation campaigns, let me start to talk about this shifting environment and surrounding Japan over the public opinion, or I would say information. In terms of disinformation, as EU cautioned that Russia and China has engaged in influence operations and disinformation campaigns around COVID-19, seeking to undermine democracy's debate and improve their own images to in the COVID-19 context. For Japan, especially China's aggressive conduct became one of Japan's concerns in its foreign affairs and security issues. China's foreign conduct, so-called, as you know, maybe wolf warrior diplomacy, have become one of more belligerent in the wake of the spread of COVID-19. With aggressive conduct, there is a growing global attention at the threats of disinformation campaigns, which is a serious threat that could shake the very foundation of democracy, as just Paula mentioned before. Also, the environment surrounding our foreign relations and public opinion are shifting as countries are forced to respond to the crisis of the spread of the virus. Policy priorities are shifting. The pandemic has forced countries, including Japan and Europe, of course, to strengthen their digital diplomacy. As the distribution of information online became more mainstream, countermeasures against disinformation will, of course, become more important, which Japan is trying to develop. So in Japan, influence operations and disinformation campaigns by neighboring countries, including China, could have serious security implications. China has endeavored to cultivate the international environment that favors its own policies by shaping public opinion in target countries. In this regard, one of China's important objectives in Japan is to, I would say, to foster positive views of China, and more strategically to weaken the Japan-US alliance and relations. If we think of China's foreign conduct, there's something we cannot ignore. Current Xi Jinping leadership has a strong interest in strengthening institutional discourse power in foreign affairs. It advocates a policy of playing an active role in global governance and the supply of global public goods, increasing China's institutional voice in global economic governance, and building an extensive community of interest. So China is attempting to form an international order that is advantageous to China over the current international society under the US-centered order. In order to support its discourse power, China has been sending out its messages to the world to deepen understanding of and to fend off criticism toward China, using both cooperative approach and coercive approach, depending on the situations. So its soft power related activities, public diplomacy activities, and influence operations, of course, could be seen as important efforts to strengthen its discourse power. So whether China's foreign conducts are based on soft power or sharp power, whether they are public diplomacy or public opinion manipulation, it all depends on value judgment of nations involved. The common point is that all of these means attempt to develop a favorable environment for China. But this is difficult for us to define each means, because each of those are very complicated and also overlapping. And it is also difficult for each of audiences to distinguish whether the information has malicious intent or not. So such difficulty is even greater when the information is transmitted online, because the authenticities of the information cannot always be verified. So this is one of the serious difficulties for political warfare over the public opinion and information. So now, talking about Japan's policies against disinformation campaigns, actually Japan lags far behind counterintelligence activities and countermeasures against disinformation. Japan's current countermeasures against espionage, for instance, intellectual property theft and disinformation at companies or universities, I mean in society level, are not as strict as those in Europe, or I would say in the United States. However, it is said that China's influence activities has limited impact in Japan than compared to other democratic countries, given the Japanese traditionally more closed culture, social and linguistic system, and the suspicion among Japanese toward Chinese influence operations. In the background of Japan's awareness of the importance of, I would say, strategic communication or any other countermeasures against foreign influence on the global public opinion, there was some aggressive political warfare conducts carried out by its neighboring countries, including China, over the territorial issues, for instance, and historical recognitions, which led Japan to strengthen its communication efforts in its foreign affairs. However, Japan's those kind of efforts have mainly focused on soft power-related approaches and activities. So it is difficult to say that Japan's strategies at this moment are strategic enough in terms of countermeasures against disinformation or fake news, so to speak. So this is wrapping up. Authoritarian state understand the vulnerabilities of democracy. For instance, as Paula mentioned, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of the press, and free elections, and so forth. And the threats of influence operations and disinformation campaigns can never be completely eliminated. The key issue to protect democracy will be how democratic countries like Japan and also EU can improve its resilience against disinformation campaign and also minimize the impact to its society and also security. So to improve Japan's resilience, interagency effort and education is of course essential, but international cooperation in this field is also one of the strategic measures for Japan. In particular, European expectation for Japan's role in combating disinformation campaign have been growing rapidly. I myself feel that through many invitations by various think tanks in Europe, including IAI, for instance, to participate in a conference and also webinar as a panelist in this kind of field. So this phenomena could be also an opportunity for China, I think. So it is expected that discussion and also joint research between EU and Japan on developing rules to fight against disinformation measures, for instance, will have a great potential for both sides. So EU-Japan cooperation will contribute to indicate the rules for disinformation campaign and also countermeasures, and to enhance the readiness to democratic countries to deal with disinformation challenges. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and over to you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Kyoko, for your insight. I have a lot of questions for you too, and I think that we will have even more from the audience. We are perfectly on time. I'm gonna switch to Tetsuro, please.
Thank you so much. I'm not a policy expert, so I'm originally a psychologist by training, and I'm a political communication scholar. So I'm going to talk about disinformation and partisanship in Japan from mostly political communication perspective.
Mr. Kobayashi, you just need to click. There you go.
Yes, it seems there's some time left. So in nutshell, I think the current situation of disinformation in Japan is characterized as low presence. But this is perhaps my personal perspective, because I'm based in Hong Kong, and I'm seeing an avalanche of disinformation coming from both sides of political divide every day in Hong Kong. So I'm subjectively comparing the situation in Hong Kong and Japan. So compared to Hong Kong, obviously the presence of disinformation in Japan is quite low. And I wonder there are some multiple reasons behind the low presence of disinformation in Japan. First of all, Japan lacks the severe political polarization. Oops. I want to go back. Can I go back? Oh yeah, thank you. So Japanese political landscape is not characterized by severe political polarization, unlike the US or Hong Kong. And unlike many other EU countries, strong populist parties are mostly absent at the national level, national politics level. And also there is a strong language barrier. So Japanese language is quite unique, and that is perhaps helping that foreign interference becomes more difficult. Unlike the US, because many people can speak and write English, it should be much easier to interfere in American politics than in Japanese politics. And the other factor is Japanese society is characterized by really high trust in traditional mass media. When you take a look at a world value survey, Japanese people still stick to TV news and newspapers as their primary news source. And at the same time, their trust in online news media are quite low. So that is another thing that is contributing to low presence of disinformation in Japan. And also people, ordinary people and politicians as well, are really inactive in using social media for political communication. So ordinary people, voters, they rarely use social media to express their own political opinions publicly. And at the same time, political elites and candidates and parties, they use social media merely for just announcing some events, not for persuading voters. So, for instance, they just announced an event. Hey, the new candidate is going to do a kind of stamp speech in at the station, in front of the station, on which day and which time. So that kind of factual announcement is the primary contents of social media used in Japan by political elites. So all these factors culminate into a low political economic incentives for spreading disinformation, especially the disinformation from foreign forces. But as Dr. Kuwahara just mentioned, there is a growing concern over foreign influence, which I'm going to briefly mention at the end of my talk. Okay, next slide. I'm clicking, but it seems to be there's a significant time lag. Yes. And at the same time, fact-checking system against disinformation is quite weak in Japan. I guess these two phenomena are the same, the two sides of the same coin. So there's a weaker, low presence of disinformation. At the same time, because the presence is low, the fact-checking system and institutions are also weak. And the policies are not well organized at the national politics level to counter fact-checking. There are some initiatives in Japan, like fact-check initiative in Japan. They are doing multiple fact-checkings, and interestingly, they also have an English page. And when you take a look at the English page, they are scrutinizing a lot of information about the COVID-19, which specifically spread by China. So it's not that there is no fact-checking organization. There are some, but overall, this is very weak. Next slide. And then, as a result, the disinformation spread in Japan are not primarily from other countries, but basically between the opposing political camps in Japan. So basically, those who support the current conservative government and those who support the liberal opposition, they are basically fighting and yelling each other on the internet. And that's the primary source of disinformation. So that's my primary message, that most of the disinformation that can be observed in Japan are partisan disinformation in domestic political context. So for instance, on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that this is kind of the disinformation which deliberately edited the former Prime Minister Abe's speech in Diet regarding taxes on the wealthy. So it edited his speech in the Diet to misguide and mislead the audience to give them the wrong impression. On the right-hand side, you can see the baseless criticism against the Science Council of Japan. saying that the council is controlled by researchers with anti-government attitudes and is cooperating with China's military speed. So both of them are ungrounded, but these are basically in line with the domestic political divide. Okay, and here's an example of one of my my recent research with my colleagues, which is still under review. We are interested in this kind of disinformation in a domestic political context. And it seems that conservative side is doing better job than liberal side in reaching out to the middle and persuadable moderate voters. So I analyzed more than 1 million, sorry, more than 1 million. So this is more than 120 million tweets collected from 2019 to 2020 and compared. So these are all tweets about the former Prime Minister Abe, because former Prime Minister Abe is kind of a reference point on which the political divides are manifest itself. And when you compare the conservative tweets and liberal partisan tweets, it turns out that conservative tweets are more effectively reaching out to the moderate and persuadable voters than partisan liberal tweets. And of course, not all these partisan tweets are disinformation or misinformation. However, a part of it are misguided and misleading, and some of them are really disinformation. So it could be said that conservative camps are doing a better job, whether it's true information or false information, in reaching out to the middle. Okay, this is basically the same results. I'm going to skip it because I have only 1 minute left. So here's the wrap up. So currently, disinformation in Japan is not being disseminated on a scale that would affect the outcome of the election. However, I think this could change with the decline of the mass media and domestic political polarization. People's trust in mass media, especially the stable subscription to the mass media, is steadily declining. So currently, mass media in Japan are still enjoying the high trust from its audience. However, in the future, it's unclear. Domestic political polarization, some people say it's increasing. So that's, if the situation changes, there is going to be larger room for this information to be spread widely. So potentially, Japanese society is vulnerable to the dissemination of disinformation. And as I said, both institutional and grassroots fact-checking are weak. So when really disinformation, the avalanche of disinformation really breaks out, Japanese society could be really, really weak and vulnerable to that disinformation. And as Dr. Kuwahara mentioned, there is a high risk that geopolitical tensions in East Asia will intensify disinformation against minorities and foreigners in Japan. So not only the disinformation from Chinese perspective, there is also a significant disinformation against ethnic minorities and foreigners in Japan. Japan had received a recommendation from the United Nations regarding the online hate speech against the Korean minorities in Japan. So that kind of hate speech related disinformation is another issue in Japan. And there are already some symptoms of disinformation in Japan. For instance, in 2019 Hong Kong protests, even in Japan, there are kind of organized disinformation campaign in Japanese language supporting the position of the mainland Chinese government. So basically justifying a clampdown on Hong Kong protests could also be seen in Japanese Twitterverse, for instance. And there are also kind of conspiracy theory believers in Japan, which echoes with QAnon movement in US. So there are so-called JAnon people who are believers of kind of conspiracy theory that basically supports former President Trump. And also, a Chinese embassy in Japan is stepping up its notch in its kind of public diplomacy in Japan. although it's not being so much successful in Japan because of the really kind of one-sided argument. So it's not really persuading Japanese people in a large scale. But we can pick up some symptoms that increasing efforts of Chinese governments to influence Japanese public opinion. And last but not least, the pandemic is also creating some new situation in Japan regarding disinformation. We can see observable number of sizable number of disinformation that stipulates the corona is just another flu. So basically downplaying the seriousness of the pandemic. And these, JANO people and some, extreme environmentalists in a liberal camp are both supporting these disinformation that, the pandemic is just a hoax. So overall, disinformation is not so much an imminent issue in the current Japanese society. However, there are some, potential vulnerability against disinformation, and at the same time, we are observing the increasing number of symptoms of disinformation from outside and inside in Japanese society. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tetsuro. Thank you very much. There are a lot of things to discuss here, especially I'm really interested in the difference, in the different background that we have basically in Japan and in Europe, for example. So especially if compared with what Paula said at the beginning. So while were you presenting, I was thinking that the EU has proven once again to be an enormous regulatory power in the global stage. So really pushing forward the agenda, trying to involve also private stakeholders and social media platforms and being more responsible for what's happening in their platforms. But at the same time, I think that is also, the European approach is very much focused on the financial side of this information. So even because from my understanding, it's a little bit easier to tackle down this information when it's linked to the use of, for example, advertisement. And at the same time, it's very interesting to learn that in Japan, there's a low presence of disinformation, but I was wondering whether maybe Japan is a little bit behind and we are living in Europe and in the US, we are living something that is maybe, a situation that can happens also in Japan in the near future. Having said that, we have few questions from the audience. I don't know whether we are gonna display them in a slide. Otherwise, I will start with my question. Here they are. Okay. Yes, this is a question from Maria Luisa Mazzei for Paula. And if you want, I can read it to you.
No, I can read it, thank you. So it's an interesting question. So I think that one thing is that in general, the approach of the Commission is to be human, to have a human-centric society, and this applies, for example, also on the communication they had and the position on, for example, artificial intelligence. We have to keep the human side in the center. The GDPR, when it came out, it was kind of an extraordinary instrument, if you want. It was again the first of its kind in the world. And the peculiarity was also that, it applies also to non-European actors as long as they are active actually in the EU. So I think it was a great result, and the reasoning behind GDPR is really great. Unfortunately, now it is seen more as a burden than as a tool that actually protects the European citizens. With regard to this information, yes, of course, transparency on how data are used is key, and this is also a pillar of the GDPR. We know that we have to know why our data are used. They have to be used for a specific purpose. They cannot stay longer than for this purpose, and so on. On this information, the issue is probably also broader in the sense that this information plays a role also, plays a lot on emotions. The more you fear something, the more you are frustrated, the more disinformation spreads, for example, on social media. And that's the algorithm of a social network, for example, work on that. So basically, if they see that you tend to, share articles that have a given position or go into a certain direction, it would continue to give you the same type of articles. These are the famous echo chambers, but honestly, we humans are also a little responsible for that, because in general, we tend to go towards things that confirm our position, where we feel safe, rather than going towards something else. So transparency in general is fundamental, not only related to data protection. There's a whole debate related to algorithmic transparency. For example, if I see an article, why is the algorithm showing me this article? Then, of course, it's a matter of really seeing if really everybody would then check why the algorithm is showing you a given article or not. I just wanted to very briefly go back to what Lorenzo was saying. In my presentation, I focus, of course, on the policy that relate more on the EDMO role, let's say. There is the whole foreign affairs, let's say, side, which is there, the Stratcom, the EU versus Disinfo, for example, that is doing a great job. As I was mentioning before, I think disinformation really has different motivations behind. The two main are, of course, political and financial. But you are right in saying that what I presented is the part of the platform, let's say. So how the focus is on the business model of this platform, how they work, and on the other side, the resilience of society and so on. There is, of course, the foreign dimension, which is there, and which actually everything started from that, actually. Like even the European approach started in reaction to actually foreign interference. So this was a trigger, of course, and this makes it also interesting, in my opinion, because you have these two parallel strands. You have the elections, you have the foreign interference, and then you have overall the issue of disinformation as such, how it works, and its dynamics.
Thank you, Paola. I think we have another question, and this is for Kyoko.
Okay, I get it. Maybe I understand that this audience wants to introduce how to develop the counter measures against disinformation for Japan, because Japan is still far behind to develop the counter measures against disinformation. So I would say that also Lorenzo just asked me a few minutes ago about China's influence operations, or I would say disinformation campaign presence is still low level in Japan. So and why is that, right? So I would say I will collaborate the question and answer. So China's influence has I just mentioned before, a limited impact in Japan because of its traditionally closed culture, social, and linguistic system. For instance, about linguistic system, the word order of, for instance, norms or verbs, and also other phrases different from those of English and, for instance, Chinese. So this is what Professor Kobayashi just mentioned before. And also those kind of system are very different from the other democratic countries, and also suspicions about Japanese among Japanese toward Chinese influence very high level. As for Japanese public opinion, for instance, unfavorability of China is growing in the wake of China's recent aggressive activities. According to public opinion survey, which was conducted by Japanese Japanese group late last year, about 90% of Japanese people have negative views of China. So on the other hand, Japanese business community has strong ties with China, which could, of course, greatly influence the Japanese government's policymaking process toward China. Also, Japanese grammar is unique, I mentioned. And those kind of interrelated factors why Japanese disinformation presence in Japan is low level. So Japan, in any case, in this era, needs to develop an interagency effort. And also, as Paula said, collaboration with fact checkers and also KPI is very much important to fight against foreign influence operations and also disinformation campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyoko. And I want to raise a question for all of you, because recently I worked on a report for the European Think Tank Network on China with my colleague Francesca Ghiretti, which focused on China's soft power in Italy. And while we were working on this commentary, I started looking at the activities of China state-linked pages on social media, and especially on Facebook and on Twitter, the activities of pages linked to the embassy of China or Chinese state news media outlets started posting more and more. They became more vocal, especially on political issues. And so the thing that I was wondering, and I still have this question in mind, is that we basically we don't have direct access to Chinese audience. So the European Union, for example, has some channels in WeChat or can post articles on Chinese newspapers, but of course it can be censored. Okay, but at the same time, Chinese officials can publish and speak freely on Western social media, let's say. And so there's a kind of an imbalance in the possibility of reaching out to different audiences in our countries. And so I was wondering whether, do you think that there's something we can do to counter these imbalances, or we should stick to the idea that of course everyone can post anything on especially on social media platforms? And I know it's a very broad question, but it's also tricky to frame it in a non-confrontational way.
Well, on my side, of course, this is not the main focus of EDMO. So the only thing I could say is that there are fundamental rights respected. Europe is based on values, and this is the basis of Europe. So My instinctive answer would be, we don't ban you because we believe in freedom of expression, and so you would be free to post your post on social networks or media in general in Europe. That's my instinctive reaction to that. Then, of course, it goes then back to if it is a state actor that actually spreads this information in Europe, how can we make sure that this doesn't have an impact and be resilient and so on. But the principles of Europe are those. I mean, we are a value-based community, and this applies every time Europe reacts to something. We cannot, let's say, deny our values.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I do agree, and but of course it's challenging, and
it is.
That's why. Please, Tetsuro, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I totally agree with Paola. So I understand the imbalance that just Lorenzo mentioned, but we should not perhaps, for instance, engage in any kind of censorship, kicking out any Chinese media from global online platforms. So I think that's what actually the major social media are doing right now. For instance, Twitter is allowing any Chinese high-rank officials to speak up on Twitter, but at the same time, they are adding that this is a Chinese government-sponsored media or high-rank officials to make it clear that this could be a part of the propaganda effort. So I think that's a really kind of reasonable compromise between securing the freedom to speech, which is basically part of the soft power on the Western side, and raising the caution against the potential disinformation campaign. And there are increasing number of studies that kind of public diplomacy made by Chinese government is not really working as intended in many countries. In many cases, especially in the countries that are not in a good relations with China, those propaganda campaign on social media have backfire effect. So the more they try to persuade the people in those other democratic countries, it actually backfires. So basically, we should be aware that those public diplomacy campaign made by Chinese government is primarily driven by domestic factors in China. So it's not really all about persuading the people in other countries, but it's more about internal competition among Chinese political arena. So that's another viewpoint that we need to keep in our mind to understand the disinformation campaign, not only made by China, but in any case, I guess. Yeah.
Please, Kyoko.
Oh, okay, thank you. Talking about as Kobayashi, Professor Kobayashi just mentioned about public diplomacy. I would say that if I talk about the background of Japan's awareness of the such foreign influence operations and operations, and also on global public opinion, and also Japanese public opinion. There was some environmental changes surrounding Japan. For instance, including China, Japan's neighboring country, including China, strengthen its propagandistic activities in the West, like anti-Japan propaganda. On the issues of territory and sovereignty, China has used its media strategies, for instance, to assert its territorial claim on the Senkaku Island. In Chinese, it is called Diaoyu Dao. And on the issues of historical recognitions, China has engaged anti-Japan propagandistic activities in concert with South Korea to influence especially the US public opinion. Those moves made Japan to realize that the need to strengthen its communication approach and capabilities in its foreign affairs. And under the second Abe administration, Japan doubled its public diplomacy budget, actually. So those activities conducted by China, as Lorenzo mentioned, for instance, media strategy, and also, for instance, developing Confucius Institute to promote Chinese language and also Chinese culture and also history. And also the public diplomacy activities, which all nations involved do the same thing to improve its own image and also improve its own presence in the global international society. So at the same time, as I mentioned before, those activities and also those approaches could be seen as sharp power, not as soft power related approaches by the other democratic nation if they are conducted by authoritarian countries. This is the current trends. So I would say that we have to have an ability to recognize which one is which one is public diplomacy or public opinion manipulation or not. And also we have to recognize that there were some areas where we should cooperate or communicate them aggressively. For instance, territorial issues and also human rights issues, as we see in Xinjiang, issues in Xinjiang, and also democracy and freedom, and also freedom of navigation. Rule-based international order, for instance, we have common values and also common recognitions of those kind of values among Japan and also EU. So we should see those kind of issues and also points of very that we want to communicate well with other countries, for instance, China. And also we have to recognize that which one is soft power approach or sharp power approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyoko. And we have just one last question from the audience. And is still linked to foreign meddling and especially on China, but more on the economic pressure that, of course, China can use when some countries sides on political issues that China's considered to be domestic issues. And I think that, of course, this question goes to our Japanese guests.
Okay.
And I want to. Yes, please, Tetsuro, please.
Yeah, definitely these issues are recognized by, of course, by Japanese government and Japanese people. So in a bigger picture, this issue can be framed as kind of a dilemma in terms of like conflicts in value and economic ties. So China is the biggest trade partner for Japan, and that's the fact. So of course there is some incentive for Japan not to step up the level of conflict between China. And that's, of course, not only Japan. US and other EU countries are also in that kind of dilemma, because when we really want to be challenge the human rights issues in Xinjiang, for instance, those countries have to face some kind of economic consequences. For instance, as for example, the Australia had some economic consequences over the issue of human rights violation. So I think that the recent issues of the Xinjiang cotton in Uniqlo and others are basically, making Japanese people aware of this dilemma. So more and more people are aware of the mutual economic dependence between Japan and China, and at the same time there is a sharp and stark inconsistency in terms of the political values. So this is kind of a task and challenge for all of us, how to reconcile these economic mutual interdependence and incongruent political values. I don't have any clear answer for that. From one perspective, due to the economic interdependence, we can, keep the peaceful dialogue. If you're not in the economic mutual interdependence, it will be much easier to engage in military conflict. So that basically the economic mutual interdependence is, of course, working against the military conflict, which is the good thing. But at the same time, that is linked with the human rights issues such as the Xinjiang cotton. So there is no, I think, clear and easy answer for this solution for this dilemma. Germany, for instance, is facing the same kind of dilemma, I guess. And the political leaders in the Western democracies are, struggling and seeking for effective solution, but I haven't seen any, clear answer for that. My 2 cents.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether Kyoko wants to add something. Otherwise, okay, please.
Oh, okay, yeah. My answer is also almost the same as Mr. Kobayashi, Professor Kobayashi just told us. And also, if I add one thing about those kind of issue, the Japanese government has been aware of it, of course, but it doesn't provide any kind of specific aggressive measures, nor, for example, including disinformation campaign or also information influence operations. They have not say any specific countries or target any specific country that could be potential threats. So on the other hand, at the ministries and agency level, and also think tankers, and of course, Japanese company, business communities level, it is recognized, it has recognized that those kind of issues, for instance, human rights violation going on in Xinjiang, and also disinformation campaign and influence operations are serious threats for democratic countries, including Japan. So this is what I've heard, and also this is what we have to seriously consider and also seriously tackle with Western countries, including European unions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyoko. And I have to say that we have focused a lot on what we can call China's Chinese attempt to spread disinformation in Europe and in Japan. But I have to say that it's quite a new phenomenon, and it's very difficult to frame it. In Europe, I have to say that maybe we are a little bit more concerned or used to Russian attempts to spread disinformation, and I have to say that even though there's some pressure coming from Washington, trying to frame both Russian and Chinese disinformation attempts in the same way. I have to say that they are very, very different, and the Chinese one uses different kind of tools and is not pervasive as the Russian one. I want to ask something. I mean, I have a question for Paula, because I mean, as we have learned, as I learned today, this morning, I mean, the Japanese environment it's very, very different from the European one. And of course, I mean, the thing that there's a low presence of political polarization means that, of course, there's a little room for domestic disinformation. And of course, I mean, there's the concern of foreign meddling, but at the same time, as Tetsuro and Kyoko explained to us, even in that field, I mean, there's a less action, let's say, that if compared to Europe. I was wondering, I mean, do you think that cooperation between the EU and Japan would be useful for Japan? Because, I mean, in Europe, we can provide the know-how that so far we acquired in trying to fight disinformation, or do you think that, and this would work at the bilateral level, or do you think that this is something, I mean, that we should do at the multilateral level, so promote counter disinformation strategies in multilateral institutions. So as a multilateral effort and not a bilateral effort.
Okay, let me start with the first part. I see two elements at the beginning to let's say set the scene. So one thing is that I think that the absence of polarization was mentioned, but then another key element is the language. It's true, the language barrier can actually be a filter to at least external disinformation. So I think this is a very important element, and actually language is a key element also in Europe when doing fact-checking, when collaborating among fact-checks. I mean, language has a role in disinformation in general. The other thing is that I wanted just to stress the fact that disinformation can be internal and external. And we saw also this morning that there can be links between internal and external disinformation. But also let's remind, disinformation is political, but also financial, psychological, social. I mean, there are lots of different disinformation strategies. We saw it with the pandemic. I mean, it's also like people who really want to create harm to other peoples because they're angry against the institutions, and here it's an overall new chapter on the impact of online disinformation on trust in institutions. I mean, there are lots of different disinformation strategies that don't only relate to political aspects, let's say. So just wanted to stress this, to now bridge to your question, which I think, though Japan is indeed, we learned this morning, different compared to the European case, I think it is important to share best practices, to know and learn from each other, because I mean, precisely because this information is not only political, and because it is external and internal, it is very important actually that we do keep this dialogue, that we learn from each other, that we know how to deal with things. And let me also say, we are actually a global society, we are an international society. Universities are moving towards English-speaking lectures and so on. This means that actually at a certain moment, actually, the national barriers will of course stay because of the political, for example, disinformation, but not for the others. And I think there is one example that I just wanted to mention to show you also. For example, we talked about the pandemic, so more the social and the safety and the health. But there was a very small village in Macedonia, which became very famous because basically there was a group of people who were starting sharing online disinformation promoting Trump. And at the beginning, no one was understanding why at a certain moment there was this mass, let's say, disinformation campaigns. And actually, these people just realized they could do a lot of money. So this is how basically something that was looking as political was actually had a purely economic motivation. I mean, they realized they could do lots of money, and they just did that. And so something that was at the beginning perceived as something political had a completely different motivation. So disinformation is really a sector in which there are lots of motivations that get together, and also agents. Let me go back, for example, the link between internal and external. I mean, you can have internal disinformation that creates political chaos. And then you have a state actor somewhere else that basically doesn't produce new disinformation. It just basically reshares what is already there. So this is, I mean, there are lots of techniques, lots of tools and so on. And I think the more we share best practices, the better it is, because it might be that in Japan, for example, at a certain moment, they realize new online techniques that we still don't see here, for example. And let's also remember that techniques, unfortunately, often also start offline. And there are lots of offline things that then move online and back offline. So it's I mean, as you can see, it's a lot of different dynamics. And I think sharing knowledge and best practice is always the answer in these cases.
Thank you very much, Paula. And yes, I think I have to say that it's very, very broad as a topic, and it's very, very difficult even to understand. I mean, even to frame it when it comes to political cooperation and institutional cooperation. Tetsuro, Kyoko, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to add Paula's point. So I think personally, the collaboration or comparative study between Japan and Italy will be, for instance, very much fruitful, because the studies on disinformation is primarily done in the American context or some European context. But for Japan, political system of Japan and US is so much different. However, Japanese system and Italian system are much more similar than Japan versus American system. We both employ multi-party parliamentary system. So in engaging a kind of cross-national study, we need to control the various factors as much as possible, because otherwise we cannot know which points can be regulated by policies, right? So if we learn, we can learn something from the disinformation issues in the United States, but because the political systems are very different, the points that can be regulated by policy could be very different. But when we compare Japan and Italy, it's much more similar, much more close. So the experience from Italy can be more easily imported to Japan, I guess. So from that viewpoint, I guess the collaboration or collaborative research between EU and Japan would be very much fruitful and promising.
Please, Kyoko.
Okay, thank you. Of course, definitely, there are so many things to do for us to cooperate and collaborate. And also, Japan has so many things to learn from Europe in the field of disinformation campaign, and also countering disinformation campaign, and also countering influence operations. For example, Japan is promoting free and open Indo-Pacific Ocean, which we call it FOIP concept, and adhering internationally accepted rules, including freedom of navigation. This is also applied for Europe, I think. So Japan can take a role to in the Indo-Pacific to maintain rule-based international order and reach out to the related countries, including Europe. And so regarding the challenging theme, this theme of disinformation campaign, and also promotion of, like, for instance, software-related approaches for both sides, toward both sides. We can also seek opportunities to conduct joint research, for instance, and information sharing to develop the, for instance, like systems to counter disinformation campaigns and to maintain the rule-based international order. And also we can also promote interaction among researchers in cooperation with each other's, like, for instance, government and also think tankers. And also a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, Ms. Natalie Toch IAI visited our think tank, JAIA, to talk about EU-Japan cooperation among economy. So this is one case to advance each other's relations, I would say. And also, I believe that I strongly believe that both sides of Japan and EU have been growing expectations of each other's role. And for instance, this January, late January, Japanese Prime Minister Motegi attended the EU Foreign Affairs Council for the first time among the Japanese foreign minister. So we have a lot of choice to work together and to maintain rule-based international order and to counter disinformation campaign together.
Thank you, Kyoko. And yes, I have to say that, I mean, last year during the online leaders meeting between the EU and Japan, disinformation was one of the main topics in the agenda. So I have to say that at the high political level, there's awareness, of course, that this is a great field of possible cooperation between the two actors. Even though I have to say that I do agree with Tetsuro, so maybe a grassroots cooperation between researchers and maybe even smaller institution on both sides would be very, very beneficial for both Europe and Japan. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, even though I have to say that I have a lot of questions. Of course, I will use my privilege to bother the panelists in the following weeks and ask them to answer my question. And I really hope to have you here in Italy once the pandemic will be over, and we will have the chance to organize another conference, maybe on this topic as well, and discuss this time in person. So thank you for having accepted our invitation and for your insightful presentation. And thank you very much.